Rings of Power Season 2 is an absolute abomination. I thought I would have learned my lesson after Season 1 to not waste my time with this show. But you know what they say, once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it. So I once again have subjected myself to enduring another 9 or so hours of this godforsaken garbage. There is so much wrong with Rings of Power Season 2 that one could go on for hours and hours and hours nitpicking every detail, and trust me, some people have. But I'm gonna do my best to explain why I think Rings of Power Season 2 sucks as concisely as I can. So the best place I think to start off is by taking a look at the main plot, which is the driver of the whole story, that of course being Sauron and Celebrimbor forging the Rings of Power. Not only are there a plethora of problems and story beats that don't make sense in the storyline, but the problems found here also leak over to the other subplots developing problems as well. At the end of Season 1, we see Sauron making his way into Mordor. Why exactly he goes back to Mordor is unclear, but that is the final scene of the season. At the beginning of Season 2, skipping over the prologue, he has for some reason decided to turn himself into Udar's army. Why has he done this? I have no clue. He has nothing to gain by doing this. Sauron, who is still masquerading as Halbrand, tells Udar that Galadriel has now seeked out the help of a dark sorcerer, and that if he sets him free, that he can find out where he is and lead Udar's army right to him. Udar has no reason whatsoever to trust that Halbrand will do this or keep his end of the bargain, but does it anyway after he, quote-unquote, swears allegiance. Halbrand rides off to Eregion, implying to Udar's army that Sauron is in fact hiding in Eregion. The fact that Sauron baits Udar's army into attacking Eregion in the first place, where he is later going to be continuing his work on forging the Rings of Power, is really stupid on his part and makes no sense, but I'll touch on that more when we get to it. So Halbrand makes his way back to Eregion, which is extremely risky on his part because he has no idea whether or not Galadriel has spread the news to the rest of the elves that Halbrand is in fact Sauron, but the writers treat this scenario like it isn't even a possibility because Galadriel in fact didn't tell anybody, which is probably one of the dumbest character decisions I have ever seen. If Galadriel does in fact tell the elves, in particular the elves in the realm of Eregion, which she has absolutely no reason not to, the true identity of Sauron, then the entire plot of Season 2 does not happen. But the writers forgo this basic common sense, continuing the legacy of this version of Galadriel being one of the most narcissistic and stubborn people I have ever seen. She decides not to admit to the fact that she was blind from the beginning, and unable to properly warn Celebrimbor of this man because they need the plot to happen. Can you imagine what would have happened if Galadriel would have just told Celebrimbor, yeah, that man that you crafted the 3 Elven Rings with, that was Sauron. Ah, Celebrimbor, my friend, it is me, totally not Sauron, and I have come to forge more rings. Kill him. What? But because Celebrimbor doesn't know this information, he eventually decides to shelter Halbrand for the time being after Halbrand dangles the "I have the information about the 3 rings that you really want to know about" lure right in front of him. After Halbrand tells Celebrimbor that the Elven Rings have worked wonders, he then suggests that they should make rings to help save the race of men. Celebrimbor hates that idea and shoots it down, so the conversation quickly shifts over to the dwarves. Halbrand tells Celebrimbor that the dwarves are having great problems of their own to try and convince Celebrimbor to create rings for dwarves. The massive issue with this being that there is no way that Halbrand should even know about what's going on in Khazad-dûm. The problems that they are having with their mountain literally just happened, and there is no indication from the story that any call for aid has been sent out in that brief time due to King Durin's stubbornness. So why would he know this? After Celebrimbor is still apprehensive to make rings for dwarves, Halbrand transforms into Anatar, telling Celebrimbor that he is a god sent from the Valar and the giver of gifts or something like that, presumably changing Celebrimbor's perception of him. Celebrimbor isn't suspicious of this at all and just goes along with it, and the episode ends. And by the next time we pick up with these two, they're forging the Dwarven Rings. So Anatar convincing Celebrimbor to forge rings for dwarves, and Celebrimbor ultimately agreeing to it, all happens off screen. You'd think that that would be one of the most important aspects to the overall narrative, but it isn't even shown. If that doesn't speak for itself of how much of a problem that is, then I don't know what to tell you. When the Dwarven Rings are eventually completed, and Celebrimbor and Anatar gift the rings to King Durin, the rings don't behave in a way which would align with Sauron's ultimate goal, that being to rule over all the peoples of Middle-earth. As soon as King Durin puts on the ring, he starts going absolutely insane. Although it does give him some powers, it fundamentally changes who he is as a person. He becomes extremely greedy, taxing his people to an extreme amount. He seemingly loses all common sense, becoming extremely reckless and breaking his own mining laws that he signed off on years ago. And this reckless digging could very well be the destruction of not only himself, but his entire mountain. Now, why would Sauron help manipulate the rings in a way that makes the dwarves behave like this? You'd think that these rings would give the dwarves immense power, but slowly dwindle their minds into eventually worshipping their creator with the help of the one ring that Sauron will eventually forge, or something like that. But instead, within the span of a couple days seemingly, King Durin goes batshit crazy. And if that wasn't Sauron's intention, then that really nerfs Sauron overall, and would just imply that he doesn't really have any control over the power that goes into these rings or what they will actually do to people's minds. The excuse that the writers give is in the form of a throwaway line, "We brung deceit into the process." That's the excuse? Of course deceit was brung into the process. You're the master deceiver. I cannot believe that that's the excuse that the show gives for why they don't work properly. And Celebrimbor just blindly believes that that's the reason the rings aren't working, because Annatar said so. The fact that Annatar is so effortlessly able to string Celebrimbor along like this speaks more volume to Celebrimbor's gullibility more so than Annatar's intelligence. That's another problem in of itself, is that Celebrimbor is way too gullible. He does not in any way come across as one of the wisest elves in Middle-earth. It's not like Annatar has used that inconceivable of tactics to manipulate Celebrimbor in the way that he has, where you'd get the sense that Celebrimbor is just some puppet on a string and Annatar is the puppet master. And Sauron doesn't even use any of his powers until he creates the realm to trap Celebrimbor inside his own head. I think the worst example of this is when Celebrimbor refuses to make the 9 rings for men because he believes that the race of men will ultimately be too corrupted by the power that the rings possess. But when Annatar says something along the lines of, "Well, if you're not going to help me make the rings, then I'll just make them myself," and then Celebrimbor just goes along with it? If you were so concerned about these 9 rings getting made, and you absolutely did not want to make them, then just kick Annatar out. He doesn't have to be there, this is your realm. And even if the result of trying to do that results in Annatar revealing himself to be Sauron, then at least he would have had to reveal himself much earlier than he would have wanted to. And the creation of the 9 rings would have been an act of him enslaving you from the beginning, rather than you falling for the obvious manipulation. But anyways, the only reason that Sauron has to trap Celebrimbor inside of his mind is because Adar and his army are now on the doorstep of Eregion, something that he for some reason self-inflicted on himself. I still do not understand why Sauron, who was posing as Halbrand at the time, would lure Adar into following him to Eregion. Wouldn't it be much better for him to have the luxury of time on his side, so that him and Celebrimbor could forge the rings in peace without having to worry about any outside threats? And even if you argue, sure, he could have done that, but he wanted to lure Adar and the orc army to Eregion so that he could take them over, that's still a dumb plan. He already tried to take over the orc army. That was the whole prologue, and he failed miserably. They stabbed him like 4,000 times. It's not like the circumstances have changed much since then. If anything, it's gotten worse for him since Adar has proven himself to be a leader that cares about the orcs and their well-being, since apparently that's what the orcs so desire in this show, a loving father figure. What's going to be Sauron's pitch to the orcs this time? Because it hasn't changed. He still wants to rule over all the peoples of Middle-earth, so I don't know how he's gonna spin it this time to get the orcs to side with him. But hey, what do you know? I guess he figured out a way to do it off-screen, because the orcs have decided to betray Adar and now worship Sauron. Oh my god, who wrote this? Who wrote this? This plot gap is probably even worse than the creation of the Dwarven Rings. At least in the case of the Dwarven Rings, you could imply that Annatar could have convinced Celebrimbor to forge them because he was masquerading as a god, but this shit makes no sense based on what the show has established about the orcs. There is no logical way that you can fill in the gaps here. All the orcs have cared about this whole season is worshipping a master who cares about them, and defeating their enemies so that they can live in peace. So how is Sauron an upgrade from Adar to accomplish this goal? Do they really think that the guy who is experimenting on orcs to try and create weapons over flesh really gives 2 shits about you? Just look at what he did to Glug. Rest in peace, Glug, by the way. But hey, I guess we shouldn't ask questions, right? I guess we should just go along with it and pretend like it actually makes sense because the plot needs to happen. The storyline wraps up with Sauron stabbing Galadriel right in the heart area with his evil crown. She falls off the side of a massive cliff and somehow survives. From that height, she should have broken every single bone in her body. She should be a pile of mush right now, but nope. She's fine, guys, she's fine. She's got level 100 plot armor. And that about wraps up that storyline for the season. There are of course a number of other narrative inconsistencies and plot holes littered throughout this Eregion plot, but to discuss them all would take literal hours, so I just chose to highlight the ones that I found the most damaging. If you actually do have literal hours to spare though, and want to dive into every single plot hole, I'd check out Random Film Talk's video. He probably sums it up better than anybody. Now before I move on to the other subplots, since we were just discussing the rings and how they relate to Sauron and Celebrimbor's decision making, I want to highlight another big issue that I have with season 2, and that is the rings themselves, and the frustratingly vague explanations and depictions that the show gives us on how they work. After all, this show is called The Rings of Power, so you'd think that the rings themselves would get a great deal of attention and very detailed explanations on how each of them were crafted, why the way each of them were made makes them so powerful, what exactly the rings can do and cannot do, and how Sauron might have corrupted each of them. But sadly, this aspect is incredibly underdeveloped. Let's start with the 3 Elven Rings. The construction of the 3 rings goes back to season 1, where all we really know is that they are made out of mithril, gold from Valinor, and topped off with these gemstones. Why do these 3 properties mixed together produce a magical and powerful set of rings? We don't really know. The only answer that is given to us is that mithril has magical properties, I guess. Why does mithril, a specific type of metal, have magic properties? How can this power of mithril be used in the form of a ring? All this goes unanswered. The 3 rings showcase a wide variety of powers. The ability to heal being the major one, as the elves heal the magic tree, as well as multiple examples of them healing the flesh. We also see Círdan being able to manipulate fish. The 7 rings for dwarf lords are constructed using mithril, once again, but the other ores used are never really said to my knowledge. Now, do the dwarf rings have the same powers as the Elven Rings, considering they both contain magic mithril? It's never really said, but we can only assume. We see King Durin gain super strength. Why this ring filled with mithril specifically gives King Durin super strength when surely the dwarves of all people have other objects throughout the kingdom that are made of mithril? Don't know. The show never elaborates on it. The ring seemingly gives Durin transparent-like vision, where he's able to see the mountain in other ways that no other dwarf can. And finally, he's able to heal the mountain? This makes absolutely no sense. Why would this ring, filled with mithril, be the cause of the mountain's healing when the mountain is literally littered with mithril? This is such an obvious flaw, I don't know how it was overlooked. Seems like the writers forgot to bring their brain cells to work that day. And finally, we have the 9 rings for mortal men doomed to die. Sadly, these are the group of rings that are by far the most overlooked in the show. We get no indication whatsoever as to what the powers of the Rings of Men are. Now, I will give the show a little bit of slack, as we haven't gotten to the part of the story where the 9 rings have made it into the hands of any men, but that doesn't excuse the fact that the construction of the 9 is just completely glossed over. These are the set of rings that I'm actually the most intrigued by, because I want to know how the power within them eventually leads to the Kings of Men becoming the Nazgul, as we later see in The Lord of the Rings. Now, the show of course still has time to do this, and will most likely attempt to do it in later seasons, but I have no faith that it's going to be written well. What are the rings for men made out of, besides Sauron's blood? And why was Sauron's blood able to be a substitute for mithril when they most definitely have very different properties? And is that the only thing that makes them different? Sauron's blood? Is the blood of Sauron the reason that these rings are indestructible? All these questions I don't know the answer to, and the show doesn't care to elaborate on them. If I'm starting to sound redundant, then that's probably because I am. But that's not my fault, that's the show's fault. If you want to chalk this all up to, the rings have those powers because Sauron influenced them and put some of his magic shit in them, I guess you can do that. But we never actually see Sauron doing anything like that, so I'm not just going to assume anything just because it's Sauron. The writers leave so much unexplained, and the few explanations that they do give are so unspecific that it left me extremely angry and disappointed. It's very hard to get invested in these magical items if we have so little to no understanding of how said magic items function and the limitations that they have. They really have to step up their game when it comes to this stuff in season 3, because this is perhaps the most essential part of the show. Now, with that being said, before I eventually dive into the subplots and plethora of bad character writing, numerous other plot holes, and terrible writing decisions that each of those possess, I think that this is a good place to cap off part 1. If you made it this far and you enjoyed the video, then please, do me a favor by leaving a like and hitting that subscribe button. This video took a long time for me to script and make, me being a student and all, so any support would be appreciated. If you have any thoughts of your own about Rings of Power Season 2, and trust me, I know you have some opinions about Rings of Power. Then please, let me know in the comments below because I'd be interested to hear them. Also, stay tuned for part 2. I'll try to get it done as soon as possible, and if you're watching this in a significant amount of time in the future, you can find the link to part 2 in the description as well as in the outro. But anyways, with all that being said, that's all I got for today. I'll see you guys in the next one.